Hello and welcome to Varn Blog, and today I'm here with Ryan Zickgraf, whose name I have butchered in the past on air, probably many times actually.
Well, you're not the first, or you won't be the last, so I'm not sweating it.
All right, um, Ryan, you write for a bunch of people. Predominantly, I see these days in Jacobin. You've been in Compact. You are a co-founder of the now infamous Bellows. Um, and
Yes.
um, and back in the day, way back actually when you first came in my orbit, I defended the Bellows under your tenure, but not afterwards, or your partial tenure. You were not the only founder, but um, we'll talk about that
Yeah.
later.
Yeah.
um, but you are now in what is effectively my old hood. Um, I'm
What
from
part of Georgia are you from?
I'm from Macon, but I went to school partially in Milledgeville and partially in Atlanta.
Okay.
Um, so you're now in my stomping grounds. But I have not lived there. Oh God, in like 14, 15 years now. Um, so that is kind of how we're going to start today because I think exploring how politics is getting weird in Georgia in specific is a very interesting way into the kind of shifting sands of post Bernie politics. The most obvious thing is happening in Georgia is the Cop City scenario. Um, we know about the tragic killing of Tortuga, and we have seen the concerts and the various actions around that. We've also seen terrorism charges being increased and thrown at people. Um, how is that going? I mean, is like it seems like it's a very specific activist cause, but it's not going the way, say, the Floyd case did or anything like that.
Yeah. It's interesting. Not that long ago, there was some calls to say that the No Cop City, the Stop Cop City movement was going to be the next Standing Rock, and that that really hasn't come to fruition. But there has been various actions and movements. I mean, there was it in late March, early April? There was like a week of actions that they had, and they were trying to rally support here. And it was sort of a week where a lot of people came from out of state. A lot of anarchist Antifa types came for this like music festival for this whole week of action. And I was actually there the day of, like, there was a Sunday. It was like the second day of the music festival, and I decided to check it out. And I would say there's probably between 500 to 1,000 people like scattered. I mean, part of what's interesting about the Cop City area right now is that it's mostly park space, and it is really huge. I mean, they're putting this on something like 270 acres, and so in one way, there's no like one single place to be seen and sort of occupy.
Mm-hmm.
Um, but yeah, that was sort of a flashpoint at the time because there was a group that um, distracted the police, were all in black, and then went to some of the construction area and threw fireworks, set some bulldozers on fire, and then the cops swept in, and they were sort of looking for blood, and so they ended up arresting a bunch of just regular um, music festival goers that just had like mud on their shoes, and that was like their proof. So that was a big day. But since then, It's mostly been quiet. There was also a group recently. I think The Intercept did a story about this. They were posting flyers on people's cars, and they got arrested, and they were denied bail. So, I mean, part of it is the state is really, really clamping down on speech and these protesters. So you could argue that part of the reason that has been unsuccessful up until this point is that Governor Kemp and the Atlanta police and the Georgia state police have really made sure that it doesn't.
That's interesting. So I'm out here in Utah, and we've seen a lot of changes in laws around policing speech, but not censoring it. So access, limiting children's access, but in ways that require everybody to turn over IDs. A lot of attempts to silence property damage protests by throwing, the book at people, and then often dropping the charges, like once everything settles down, or dramatically amping down the charges. But at first, throwing charges that could lead to life in prison for vandalism of an AG's door. And we've seen that here too.
Okay.
So that does seem to be kind of a general trend in red states. I find it interesting because there's a lot of talk about free speech right now, and I'm not actually seeing a lot of this stuff at the state level dealt with. And I wonder why that is. One, it's not it doesn't help the GOP very much, but the other, it's not just, conservatives who aren't talking about it.
Yeah. No, it is interesting. I mean, there is a lot of red states, especially in the South, that I don't know, have been exercising a lot of power recently. And this is a sort of one arena. I mean, you have DeSantis, who has been sort of the number one governor that's been cracking down on speech and sort of targeting leftists. But, here in Georgia, Brian Kemp is almost like a junior version of DeSantis. And I mean, it's interesting that he has sort of distanced himself from the state GOP because they've been so pro-Trump. So he's been carving out his own path kind of apart from that, but yet he governs mostly like that, DeSantis. In Arkansas, what's her name? Sanders.
Elizabeth Huckabee Sanders, yeah.
Yeah.
Or Sarah Sanders.
Yeah. She's been kind of doing the same thing. And the left here doesn't really know quite how to respond to it, I feel like.
It seems almost because it's a junior partner to DeSantis, they're not going nearly as far. They don't know how to respond, because it's you can't really pin Kemp as going nearly as batshit as some of DeSantis is going. You can't do that here for Cox in Utah either, but there are laws that are just amping things up. There's a whole lot of local control stuff that's been reversed. This was an interesting move that started during COVID, where a lot of stuff was actually, well, we're going to turn it over to localities. Oh, the localities don't want to do what we want. We're going to centralize it in the state legislature, which is dominated by rural politicians who are overrepresenting 5 people. I'm only vaguely exaggerating. And that tendency is not as bad in Georgia as it is in Utah, because Utah has an extremely concentrated population. But it is still a thing in Georgia, where you have huge areas that have a lot of representatives where there really aren't that many people. And I think it's interesting because there's also a way in which the left is talking about Georgia as a purple state because of its congressional and national representation. And I've been trying to push back on that somewhat.
Yeah.
Because I'm like, guys, to say, like, it is just objectively the case that some of the same people that put that Democratic senator in office also voted for Kemp again. And that Cynthia
there
McCain
was like an
lost
8 point.
embarrassingly.
There was like an 8 point difference there, where people were voting for Kemp and for Warlock. And but yeah, with talk about the purple state. I mean, you had a historically bad candidate with Herschel Walker. And the state house is just totally locked down here for the Republicans. And Kemp has just, with all of Stacey Abrams' hype, Kemp was able to expand his lead in the last election. He narrowly won 4 years ago, but this time, he crushed Abrams. So, I think that the Democrats are kind of, it's a little bit of wishful thinking.
Yeah, I've seen that too. I know that there's been a move by the Biden administration to try to put Southern Democratic Black voters, in specific, more in the forefront of the party.
Well, that's partly Bernie protection. They don't want a repeat of what Bernie was able to do in Iowa and New Hampshire. So they're like, oh, we need to put South Carolina first, because you saw how they went, in 2019, 2020.
Right. We can frame it as racial, but as I pointed out, like, if you really wanted it to be racial, you could also put it in Chicago or Michigan. I mean, because Detroit and Chicago are also Black electorates, but they're not actually as moderate, in quotation marks, as the Southern Black Congressional Caucuses, which effectively, and I have pointed out for years, but I don't think people have really understood what I meant, took over the Dixiecratic political machine, when a lot of these state house people just changed their D's to R's. And that's another thing about Georgia politics at the state level that people don't realize. Incumbency is incredibly powerful in that state. These people, some of these people have been in office 30, 40 years, and they have just changed parties as the political winds have changed. It's not even about the GOP. It's no, they run this district. You're not getting rid of them. No one even knows who they are half the time. It's an interesting problem.
The other thing too it's interesting is that a lot of the vote, I feel like, is coming down to the Atlanta suburbs, and which at some points have been more blue, but then you go a little north, say half an hour north of Atlanta, and you're in Marjorie Taylor Greene territory.
Right. So as you get just past Cummings, you're in MTG territory. I mean, and one of the things about that, this stuff can be overstated, but I will just point out to people that even some of the blue North Atlanta suburbs used to be sundown towns, as late as the 1990s. So it's a much more precarious thing than I think people realize, and seems to have been specifically about national politics, not local politics. And I guess that's the one thing that Kemp has going for him, is he and actually this interestingly also makes a strong case about the weakness of the Democratic Party at the state level, is that even though there's Trumpist contention against him, he not just won but gained ground, even with Trump coming at him. It's actually quite interesting to watch. And so I think
he decided to not even go to the GOP convention. He is like, I'm forging my own path, and there hasn't been a whole lot of political blowback from that. So it's been interesting that he's become a king of Georgia.
Yeah, that's interesting too. And One of the things that you told me you were writing about that is related to Cop City, actually, although not directly, is this expansion of things like formal homeless encampments.
Yeah.
What is going on with that? Like, that was not a thing when I lived in Georgia.
Yeah, so it's fairly new. Right now in Athens, Georgia, which is, a very liberal college town, during the pandemic, like a lot of cities, there was a huge increase in the homeless population. And they were seeing what was going on and say, I think one of their examples was in Gainesville, Florida, with the University of Florida, where they had their own sort of sanctioned homeless encampment. And when I say sanctioned, it means like the state is authorizing it and sort of funding it, setting the rules or whatever. So Athens started it in 2021, and basically there's a tent city placed behind an old segregated grade school that hasn't been in commission for 40 years, across the street from a chicken processing plant. And they're doing this sort of experiment where the homeless, it's a little bit like partly a prison camp and partly a summer camp, depending on who you are. And so they're letting people stay there. They're gonna talk about it again in October to decide whether to keep going with it. But Atlanta and other cities are figuring out whether they want to adopt it, because there has been this I was walking by, I was walking downtown the other day, and there was just a line down the street of tents everywhere. So I know, a lot of the homeless, we had that incident in New York last night, and then a lot of West Coast cities are dealing with this homeless issue. But, here in Georgia, it's an issue. And I'm actually speaking tomorrow with, they're trying this program in Atlanta where they're doing some sort of like alternative policing. A lot of it have to do with people that just got out of jail and are just homeless. But yeah, the politics of it are pretty interesting. It's not a very straightforward conservative or liberal matter, and even I feel like socialists don't even have a clear plan to deal with the homeless.
Now, I wanted to talk about this a little bit. We've had the controversies around TYT and Anna Kasparian and Stink Uyghur doing their thing. And I have disagreed with them on a lot of that because it seems to be carceral. But at the same time, I have not really heard a plan for how to, for example, deal with the fact that most of these municipalities, particularly in the South, don't have enough social workers as it is, to do basic things. That infrastructure, even compared to the West, is just lacking in a lot of places. Like, what, not in Atlanta, not in Savannah, not in Columbus, but in a place like Macon, it doesn't exist. Are some of the towns like Dublin and whatnot in the deeper south of the state. There's just not a whole lot of public infrastructure at all. And for the past decade, like, we're talking about places that can't keep hospitals open, like, and stuff like that. Like,
no, even in Atlanta, here they just closed one of the two trauma centers where gunshot victims could go. And Georgia is a state where they didn't have Medicaid expansion. So even in a city like Atlanta, which has gotten richer, like a lot richer over the last 10 or 15 years, the social services are just not anywhere where you would see in a lot of like northern and West Coast cities. And in fact, speaking of that camp in Athens, one thing's interesting is that the head of the camp told me that he had sheriffs all over the state trying to just send inmates there as sort of like, well, they have nowhere else to go and there isn't a lot of social services, so throw them in the homeless camp. So he had to say no to a bunch of, wardens or sheriffs or whatever.
I mean, I think the fact that that the left doesn't have, not just, I mean, I know what the people are going to say when we say, oh, the left doesn't have an answer to that. So they go, well, we need to give them houses. I'm like, okay, but we also need to get them addiction treatment. We need to get them jobs. We need to, in some cases, get people pretty severe mental health care and integrate them back in the community. Actually, in a lot of cases. And we have a shortage of people to do all of that now. Now, yes, some of the more, functional people who have been temporary homeless and could help on that. You could train them, etc. But I'm not hearing a lot of very active plans or proposals for like progressive states or progressive cities to do that. And we're at a point where it also looks like we're about to immediately head into a recession. Like we're about, I mean, most of the indicators are like, well, we've kind of been there for 6 months anyway, but we're definitely going to be there soon.
Yeah.
And so it just seems to me like the left has been caught kind of flat-footed on this. And at the same time, I don't want people to think that like we should be carceral on this stuff, because I'm also like, well, we have 500 people per 100,000 in prison, and only like, even though murders have increased actually fairly significantly, we're still only dealing with a national average of 7 per 100,000. Like, so I don't know. You can do the math on that, but that's like 492 people who are, per 100,000 who aren't in there for a lethal crime. So it's kind of, it's kind of a crazy thing to be dealing with, and yet to have no answer for it just looks delegitimizing.
I mean, I feel like a lot of leftists talk about, it's sort of like all you can say is housing, and that is a great long-term solution, especially if you're in a city that is able to respond to that. But for short-term and medium-term, they have no answers. So I used to I used to live in Chicago, and I used to work for the Chicago Reader. And the Reader there recently published this thing that got a lot of attention that was like, oh, what do you do if you see a homeless person in the subway? And the answer is nothing. And they wrote a whole article about how you should do nothing. And I think that a lot of times that is sort of the response, in absence of, okay, we need to build more housing, which is obvious, but to do nothing is that's a choice too. And I don't think that's solving anything either.
No, it opens, I mean, this is going to come out about 2 or 3 weeks after we recorded it, but it opens itself up to the kind of things we see in New York, which I do not want to blame on the person on the poor homeless guy who was more or less murdered, or at least manslaughtered. But it does seem like we're kind of opening ourselves up for this kind of quasi-vigilante engagement when we have no real answer help for these people, and then we say we can't do anything about it, and we're just going to that's the cost of living in a city is homeless people, as long as it's also a city that's like, warm enough weather-wise that people don't just freeze to death in the winter, because that is part of what's going on in southern and western cities, is like homelessness problems in Utah are all year round, but people being out in the streets is seasonal, because you will just freeze to death. Like, it's really kind of that simple.
But there's more West Coast cities that are trying this model of these sanctioned camps. Like in Portland, Ted Wheeler authorized, because they set like a camping ban, and then they're setting up 6 of these camps of 100 people. And so they're going to try this thing where you can't camp, but you can go into these homeless encampments. to me, it's a very like kind of maybe halfway, half-assed, whatever you want to call it, but it is an attempt at trying something new because, you know, I think the way the economy is going, I think, and that there are going to be even more homeless people in the next 5 or 10 years. I don't see that going away.
No, I mean, I actually foresee it getting significantly worse, particularly when you think about the fact that we kind of have a time bomb with a lot of provisions post-COVID about to run out. And as they're running out, also, we seem to be on the back end of a business cycle. And while the GOP decided not to blow up the dollar hegemony just to own the libs, it does seem like we're seeing frailty in bank systems. We're seeing commercial real estate start to crash. We're seeing one of the tickets into the upper middle class, which is coding, really contract because of a mixture of bad rentier policies ending now that debt's not cheap, and chat GPT AI making a lot of rote coding unnecessary. So, I mean, I just doesn't feel like it's a good time to be part of the working class, but it also seems, I don't know how you feel about this, Ryan, but I feel like the left blew its wad like when things were good.
Yes.
And now that things are not great, we seem to be spending a lot of energy coming up with very elaborate intellectual justifications for why Biden doesn't suck as bad as we think he does. Like,
yeah, or that, such as the case of the Stop Cop City movement, that you're focused on this one particular issue and kind of giving up or not really have anything to say about much else,
Yeah, so let's talk about Cop City a little bit. A lot was made about the racial dynamics of the neighborhood it was going in.
Yeah.
I was trying to remember. I mean, it is in South Atlanta, and I was like, okay, I do remember that being mostly minority back in the day. But I've also known that in the, like what I mentioned, the decade and so on since I was gone, that the dynamics of Atlanta have changed significantly.
Yeah.
So what's going on in development that's leading to this kind of conflict over the forest? Because one of the things that I was also thinking when they were talking about Stop Cop City, they were talking about the need to not develop that land. And I was like, well, that's not going to happen.
Yes.
Like, I don't know. You guys are not from the South, but it either gets developed or it gets totally abandoned. Like there's not a whole lot in between that happens there. So it just, like, I get the specifically blocking this police training complex, and I get why that's an issue. I'm not saying that's not valid, but there was a lot of discussion about like saving the wildlife in that area, and I'm like, really? Like,
yeah, and honestly, a lot of that land was part of the old prison farm.
Mm-hmm.
And it's getting dark. Maybe I'll turn on the light here.
That's okay.
So I don't look so haunting. So yeah, it was an old prison farm, and that had been abandoned for years. And so a lot of that land was trees that were sort of invasive species, and it wasn't like this pristine forest. A lot of it was just land that had been part of this camp, and it had just been sitting vacant. And inevitably, because Atlanta keeps developing and it keeps spreading out south and gentrifying, something was going to happen to it.
Well, and I want people to understand what happened to this area in the past. Like, South Atlanta was a suburb. Like, it was, hip in the 80s to live in there. then the areas around like South Atlanta between say Warner Robins or Forsyth and Atlanta, like Mount Zion or whatever, were literally places that they allowed the public infrastructure to collapse as these places became more and more black, to the point where like schools were being unaccredited and basic services were breaking down. And so it has always been ironic to me that people don't seem to understand in these areas in specific that it does seem to be a choice between bad and worse. Like, I get that some of the development issues that they're talking about are not ideal or bad. But I also know from living in that area that if it's not gentrification, people like it's literally kind of left to be a wasteland. And so it's like, what are we talking about what to do for these communities other than like, I don't know, like stopping this prison development? Because these areas were decimated years ago, and now they're being gentrified because Atlanta, like, you can't really move any further north and it be affordable. So I mean, people who work in Atlanta will live as far down as where literally Macon is now one of its industries is opening up loft apartments and abandoned buildings so that people who work in Atlanta can live there, an hour and a half away. So that's
no. There's a lot of I feel like brain dead conversations about gentrification. Matt Iglesias of all people had I feel like a tweet the other day that I agreed with, and he just talked about, again, this conversation about gentrification is like, so your alternative is that these people should just have shitty amenities and no redevelopment. Like, it's interesting on the left because there's these conversations about, YIMBYism. But then, they pick and choose when to become a NIMBY. Something that I've written about recently is the Beltline, which I'm not sure how familiar you are with that, since it's mostly been an Atlanta project of the last 10 years. But it's this trail like around former rail lines that kind of circles the city, and they've been building it for the last 10 years. And there's so many complaints about gentrification and what it's doing. And yet, you go to these paths and people use them, and it's like, well, what makes them, what raises property values around that area is it's in demand. There's a scarcity of these kind of amenities, and so you build them and people like it, and it does raise prices, but it doesn't mean that like this trail itself is inherently white or evil. It's that, a lot of people don't have the resources to live in neighborhoods when property prices go up. So it's sort of like, well, what actually is your alternative to this development? To just say no to everything because you think that it's going to displace communities is just not a great answer.
It's not an answer. Like,
yeah.
Like, if you want to talk about affordable housing, then you have to talk about like the policies that would make that so, and then how to deal with that, which means more even than just providing the housing. Frankly, we really have to talk about dealing with all kinds of market pressures and reinforcing systems like the way insurance is done and this, that, and the other to really start to get to this. And I don't want to be always the guy who says, well, some of this stuff can't be happen until we at least have some transitional program to socialism. But in some ways, I'm like, some of the stuff can't really happen until you at least have some transitional program to socialism. I don't like, like, you want to piecemeal stuff. That's been one of the most frustrating things for me, is like piecemeal reforms without thinking about the fact that doing it half-ass is worse than not doing it at all, or is actually defending parts of the status quo that's actually quite ugly. One of the things about, you mentioned the Atlanta Beltline, I was there when it was first proposed, and it was fought not on gentrification lines, but on keeping the poors, aka in this case the brown and blacks, out of North Atlanta. That was its original opposition. And so it shifting to be concerns about gentrification is really funny to me. Like, because they're like, oh, well, we don't want any more light well. We don't want to extend MARTA out into Cummings or whatever, because we don't want, these people from inner city to come. But now Atlanta and any city, like most of these bigger cities, have become immensely attractive. And so what we have is like what I mentioned about Zion. So you have these suburbs that were built originally actually as kind of white flight suburbs who are now black and brown, but only in the past like 15 years. And they don't.
That's one thing that really shocked me about when I moved here was just how diverse the inner suburbs are.
Mm-hmm.
Incredibly so.
That's because the city got gentrified. We didn't have there was nothing to deal with, and they pushed them out into the suburbs. But now we're kind of arguing that we shouldn't do anything to the suburbs because that would gentrify them by making them attractive, by making them not a shitty place to live. And to me, this was a problem. Like, it was a problem out here in Salt Lake too. I had to deal, I had to deal with a lot of activists who were fighting building multi-use housing because like, oh, well, we don't want gentrification of our city. And I'm like, you don't have enough housing units, right? You are the same people arguing we need to do something about the homeless, and yet you're stopping us building housing units. I realize a lot of these housing units are going to be luxury and shitty. I got that, but you're stopping us from building any at all. Yeah. Like, this doesn't make sense.
It kills me. There's a piece of street art that I walk by all the time. It's about a half mile. It's actually pretty close to the Beltline, but it's a mural that says, because Atlanta was infamously destroyed during the Civil War, Sherman's March. And so it says, it has a picture of a phoenix, and it says that Atlanta was burned to the ground, only to be burned to the ground again. And they have like a devil who is a developer and a politician or whatever, and he's taking money. And it's like, no, actually, a lot of these neighborhoods were kind of burnt out and were in ruins. And building new things is not burning it back to the ground. That makes no sense to me.
So can I ask you, who's actually asking for this? Do we know? Is it the communities themselves? When I was living in Macon, and this was a discussion, and again, like I said, a long time ago, but it was not the communities themselves arguing against development. Like, they were kind of hoping that anything would come. Because that city has been allowed to die. Like, average incomes dropped to, per family, $25,000 a year, which is like half the national average. Half the city's businesses are gone. There's no tax base. Like, most of the city now is either churches or the hospital, are municipal buildings. So there's no tax base. Even though they've expanded the tax base, they still can't keep stuff there. And on one hand, I've always been kind of YIMBY on like, okay, let's like do mixed development. Let's have people come in. Let's try to fight off, anybody coming in, dropping property values immediately, by trying to just keep everything up and providing enough services. But on the other hand, it's just what I've seen in Georgia was just like things were allowed to go to shit. People would ask for development. And interestingly, it was often upper middle class people who fought it. And then what actually would happen is like Mercer University would go and buy the city block. And then gentrify it themselves to create a buffer for their students. And I'm like, I was just like, come on. Like, this is almost like classic bad faith. Like I mean, I know it's not the same. It's not the activists who are Mercer University administration, but they are often their students. And so I was just confused by like, what do you want? Like, do you want to make these parts of the community better? Under capital developments, that's going to make it more expensive. Unless you provide a glut of housing, which I would love for us to do, but there's very little incentive for a city planner to do that because it's going to anger a lot of residents by dropping your property values.
And I feel like if leftists were smarter, we would spend a lot more time on zoning, going to zoning boards, trying to fix city codes. And I mean, there are so many decisions, we're talking about affordable housing, we're talking about what to do with the homeless, that because of zoning restrictions, I mean, I talked to an architect here and he said, he's interested in building affordable housing, but because of every hoop that he has to jump through, that it would take him. So the World Cup is coming to Atlanta in 2026. He's like, there's no way I can get a project done before 2026. So there's been an identification of the problem of that we need to build more housing, but the tyranny of zoning makes it really difficult. And that's something that I feel like leftists don't really have a handle on.
Absolutely not. It's actually interesting because it's one of the few things that back in the day libertarians are actually good at. And we haven't been, because I'm like, I was thinking about outside of boutique neighborhoods in the inner city where we're going to make it, walkable, which I used to be all about new urbanism. Right. And I've lived in places where that are not rich, where this happens kind of organically. Cairo cities, for example, this is actually true, where like, oh, you have a walkable market, you can live in like a city block, you don't need a car. Even in a country where like there is barely any public infrastructure, which everything's still provided in this area, but what Cairo doesn't really have is zoning laws. Sometimes that's bad. I mean, sometimes like, there's an industrial slag nearby and that sucks. But for a lot of stuff, I'm like, why are so many places like, oh yeah, we're only going to allow mixed use area downtown?
Mm-hmm.
Like, we're basically forcing people to use cars and deal with it. So much of this is self-imposed, and leftists don't seem to want to study civic design enough to know that. And I don't know. I mean, do you think it's because of where they're from?
I don't know. I think part of it is just that, leftists can be very bad at really focusing on local issues and municipal issues. We all got, with good reason, focused on, the Bernie campaigns and things like that. And I know DSA does do a lot of local actions, but again, a lot of them have to do with, say, policing. They don't necessarily, or union, like strikes and whatnot. But as far as like, let's think long term about how we can make things better, zoning affects all of us, and so few people care. It is crazy to me. I'm also today I was working on a story about the Atlanta public school budget, and because nobody has really paid attention, it is so indecipherable, and they're able to get away with more because a lot of activists are not paying attention.
Absolutely. No, like getting activists to paying attention to like one, interestingly, in a state like Georgia, the public school budget's also weird because so for example, during the downturn of 2008, I was a teacher in Georgia, and like we had to open schools that we couldn't staff. because the funding lines were entirely different. So funding the physical building is a different tax line than funding staffing it. We didn't have the tax base to staff it, but we did have the like 2 cent sales tax, temporary sales tax authorization to build the school. Ipso facto, like there you go. And I think a lot of that's coming. And the reason why I think a lot of that's coming, it's not going to affect me that much in Utah because one, we're understaffed anyway to the point of absurdity. We have school classrooms with 50 kids in them. But two, our state, ironically, because there's so much rural state, actually funds classes relatively equally. We're not based solely on our local property tax base, but Georgia is. And so one thing that's going to happen pretty soon, if this commercial real estate thing actually seems to play off the way it looks like it's going to, is a whole lot of the tax base for these Georgia schools are going to go away again.
Yeah, and you've had cities try to separate themselves, like Buckhead, which is northern part of Atlanta right now. It's very rich and more white. There was a battle in the state this year. They tried to de-annex and create their own city, and it narrowly failed. But there's even, interestingly enough, there's a town called South Fulton, which was formed in the south part of Fulton County, and it's a mostly Black city. But part of the idea was that, okay, there's these white areas which are building their own cities, and they don't have to contribute to Atlanta. Well, we kind of have to protect what's ours and do the same thing. So you had Mableton, a new town in the county, spring up here a few months ago, and it's a majority Black, but it raises issues of class for sure. But yeah, the school funding in the Atlanta area is a mess.
Oh yeah, I mean, one of the things about so Georgia school funding, I mean, to get into the weeds here a little bit, I don't think people realize this is county based, but Atlanta is 3 counties. But all those counties also have areas outside of Atlanta. So you have like DeKalb, Gwinnett, and Fulton.
Cobb.
Yeah. Oh yeah, and Cobb. So they have 4. Who are all technically part of the Atlanta, like the greater Atlanta school system, since the school system is not consolidated in the city anyway. You have 4 different operating school systems within the city parameters. There are other places that have similarly complicated, like actually Salt Lake has a similarly complicated system, but it's like it's almost impossible to know. Sometimes like your school district is not necessarily contiguous with any other of the voting districts. I guess it kind of is, but when you start having these cities start parceling off too, you have these now like Swiss cheese holes in the tax base. It's a nightmare. Like, and it's and I get why people do it. Like, it's like incentivized in the system the way it is right now. But it also means that basically you have internal to a municipality tax competition to drive all kinds of bizarre funding choices in this school system. And it's schools, it's not like Atlanta schools are known for being amazing in the first place. Although some of them are. But
well, they're slowly going to more charter schools. For this budget, they're talking about 20% of their resources going to charter. So it's becoming more and more that way.
That's interesting to me because Georgia had not been as charterized as some other places. And it's also interesting because out west, which is a lot more charterized actually than say the South used to be, we've turned the opposite direction because there's been so many financial scandals and embezzlement schemes, and we've had to shut down so many charter schools, even in a state like Utah, which like is very forgiving on that stuff. And it's just you are seeing a pretty big turn against that. But I suspect, honestly, some of the racial dynamics in politics may be part of why that's happening.
Yeah, it is. I will say though, it is interesting. In the city of Atlanta, and I was mentioning this new town called South Fulton, because it's actually, the mayor is a leftist. He was like a big Bernie supporter. I can't remember his name. It's like Kamal, I want to say, and he's the mayor, and he's branding this city as like a black, it's in like their town slogan, like proud to be black. Like he wants to make it sort of a Wakanda. He even said that term. He's trying to make Georgia's Wakanda. So there is so many fascinating political developments going on. And one thing I wanted to say about Atlanta too is that part of what's interesting is that recently became the most unequal city in America, the most unequal. But
even more than California cities.
Yeah, wow. I was really surprised to see that. But one interesting dynamic is, you have all those people that talk about representation. Well, Atlanta's leaders are overwhelmingly black. I went to the mayor's State of the City address, and I was like kind of amazed at, the superintendent, the mayor, the city council is partially black. The school board is all women and half women of color. So you have this incredible amount of racial and sexual representation, but yet it is the most unequal city, in the country. So it's,
yeah, and specifically, I've been looking at stats on black poverty in Georgia, and it's like been largely unchanged since it got worse during the beginning of the Obama administration during the Great Recession. And
it's been great for the black middle class. I mean, there's a huge black middle class here, and I remember, what's his name, Charles Blow, the New York Times columnist, talking about, like, a few years ago, he was like, let's have this exodus. Let's have this black middle class exodus to Atlanta. This is like the black metropolis. And in some way that actually has come to be, but we've seen how, again, there's a massive class difference. There's, a thriving black middle class, but is not helping the vast number of poor blacks.
Yeah, no, I mean, that's, my experience in the South, and my experience of actually being an anti-racist activist in the South, like that was my first, way back when I was a teenager, my first big concern. Before I kind of became a conservative, whole story, not gonna go back into it, but has been that story is like, no, the existence of a black middle class does not actually mean that people's lives have improved if they're black. And it does, my experience of that has just made me distrust that narrative when I see it. It's made me go, okay, is this about like making the divisions amongst a dying pie fair for people who have been historically marginalized but also have resources? Like, we're not expanding the pie to the vast majority of black people. If you look at the stats, that's exactly backed up, and that's across the board too. I mean, like we talk about, like, oh, colleges have gotten way more diverse, but a lot of it is foreign exchange students. And people complain about the ADOS movement, and I get why they do, and also I don't even disagree with them about a lot of the problems there, but I'm also like, but they have kind of a point. Like, there's so many people who are coming in under this universal representation idea and then getting nothing for it, and a lot of the people who supposedly this is supposed to help, it is not helping. And my argument has always been kind of Adolph Reed's is like, look, if you just deal with poverty, you would deal with a lot of the problems. There's a huge wealth gap between, even when you factor out the super rich, between black people and white people. But the funny thing is, the entirety of that wealth gap can be explained by housing values. The entirety of it.
Right.
Like, it's like pay discrimination, everything. It's like you fix a couple of things and a lot of this goes away. I'm not saying they're easy fixes, because they're not, but you have to know zoning laws, you have to deal with insurance law, you have to be building up public services to everybody, you have to quit, like, what's the actual problem with gentrification? Like, it's not the development, like, it's that we're letting these people get displaced. So let's fix that.
Exactly.
Like, if we do that, but it sometimes I do feel like there's been this way in which a lot of the left's response has been, I mean, I think it was worse actually around 2016, 2017, but a lot of the left response is basically like, well, we can do like three things: Medicare for all, free college, and I don't know, housing for poor people, I guess. Although we're not going to explain how we're going to do that. And maybe abolish the police.
Yeah.
No, but no, I mean, we mean to fund the police. Like, it's smart to take money away from the people with the guns, but leave them with.
Well, and it was living wage, but after that got voted down, you haven't heard much of a peep about that since then.
No, you have not. Actually, what have we heard peeps about? Like, Medicare for all has not been on the docket since it's had I am waiting though for it to come back now that it can't get through the House, but we'll see.
Yeah. Well, we need to, because I mean, as you said earlier, with the pandemic protections falling apart, it's going to be devastating once a lot of the rug is pulled for so many people's healthcare.
I mean, Atlanta is an interesting place to talk about this, though, because one of the things I always talk about is like, guys, you like leftists, listen to me. You live in a federalized country and you want to change a bunch of stuff, but to do that, you're going to have to win over rural people. Now, yes, a certain amount of rural people are going to be bigots. A certain amount of urban people are going to be bigots. Frankly, like, a certain amount of people are going to be bigots. I do not think that is an insurmountable barrier to policy. I just don't. I've seen evidence in other places that people get over that once you provide stuff. In fact, there's all kinds of sociological evidence. It's like, say, like stuff like racism goes down if people do not feel like they're in direct competition for work. We actually there's multiple studies that back this up. So if you want to deal with both like the rural reaction problem and you actually want to, I don't know, ever fucking win anything, like, because unless you think you're going to insurrect your way against a government with, drones that took out rail-trained armies, and even though they couldn't win these areas, could definitely kill way more than you have, you don't really have a viable plan for an electoral strategy unless your electoral strategy is basically like, well, we can just bring all the country to Brooklyn. I don't really think, like, you do need to deal with this stuff. You need a rural development plan, a real one. You need to start really caring in a systemic way about zoning, about rural hospitals, about getting people back out into those areas to help keep those services up. You need to make that attractive. I mean, there's, and you would think COVID would have helped with that, because now we have all this remote work, but it doesn't seem to have at all.
Yeah.
So it's,
and I spent a lot of time at the State House during this session.
mm-hmm.
Georgia, and I spoke with some leftists and some activists that were there. But can you guess what issue that it seemed to be one of the only issues they cared about? Can you guess what it was?
No.
Well, it was about the trans issue. And I understand why they're so upset, but it was almost the only thing they could organize for, and there was a host of other issues, very important issues, like school funding, that just sort of slipped through the cracks.
So one thing I think we have to realize about Americans is they're motivated by fear more than most places I've lived. I don't like generalizing about a group of people like that generally, but I'm as an American who's lived 10 years outside of the country, I feel like I can say that. And a lot of the fear is legitimate, and I totally get it, but you can walk and chew bubble gum at the same time, right? Like, and honestly, if you want to win on that issue, you have to win on the others too, because you have to disempower these people. And the only way to disempower these people is to prove that you can provide things to a base.
Yep.
And in doing that, you will also prove that trans people are not a threat to them. Now, I have been really frustrated about this whole not being able to walk and chew bubblegum thing on the left for a long time, because it just feels like we go through I don't want to say fads, but like we let the right set our agenda by the right initiating moral panics and us responding to it. Thus, we do not have our own agenda beyond, I guess, harm reduction. But what is so frustrating about that, we talk about harm reduction. Remember when we all cared about immigration?
Yeah. It's been a while.
Well, yeah, it's been a while since anyone said a word about that.
Biden's sending troops down there, and we're like, okay.
Which, it's funny because it proves a lot of things, because of course the Republicans are calling it political theater, and I'm like, but that's what you actually asked for. He's conceded to you, and now you're like, well, we're going to call it what it is, and I'm like, why is anyone playing this game? But also I totally get that most of the American political system is hypocritical. It's actually not a bug, it's a feature, but it is super frustrating to be like, we supposedly really cared about kids in cages 2 years ago, 4 years ago. Now we kind of care. Some of us care. I'm not saying no one cares, but it is not an agenda item. You are not willing to sacrifice anything for it. And okay, people might go, well, we have this attack right now. And I'm like, yeah, but you're also not winning on that either.
Mm-hmm.
like where you already had cultural power, you are winning. And interestingly, public opinion is largely even already with you, and you're not winning.
Yeah.
So what are you not understanding? Because this is not about winning hearts and minds in. God, I mean, you have Peter Thiel getting worried about it. It's kind of crazy.
And there's so much energy expended on being, like, reacting to whatever the right's doing. Like, okay, now all of a sudden, I care about what's on a Bud Light can, or, you have a lot of, all of a sudden, okay, we're going to have drag shows every day because the right hates it so much. I just feel like there's so much energy expended on these culture wars, and instead of like recognize it, I mean, you had Steve Bannon putting out in the open that these culture war distract us from economics, and we're just like, oh yeah.
So Rob Amari over at Compact, supposedly not our guy, right? And he's not our guy. He's a Catholic theocrat, but was one of the people who was saying, like, look, these cultural issues when the country's falling apart doesn't make sense, even for conservatives. And I'm like, okay, that may be how we start approaching this. Like, point out the absurdity of this in light of everything else going on, it might also be a defense for these people. Like, I don't know. I mean, I do not want to belittle anyone's moral concerns about this, but we really do have to walk and chew bubblegum at the same fucking time. Like, I don't really know how else to phrase it. Like, we have to do multiple things. We can't set one thing down because the right has figured out how to bait us. Or 5 things down to respond to one thing, because it's like, yeah, they're going to do shit. And the more we respond to it, the more they seem to do it too. Which is not to say that we're responsible for them doing it. I'm not laying the blame, but you do need to know how this is functioning. And it's very frustrating. And it's very frustrating that the left cannot separate itself out from left liberals on these issues in a way that also doesn't feel like it's like tailing the right. Like, you know, to talk a little bit about that, I guess we can. Your former website magazine is sort of infamous for that, although in your defense, it happened after you were ousted. Why do you think, you know, and we saw a lot of post-leftist, and initially I was sympathetic to post-leftists, even though they annoyed me, because I also get annoyed by some of the same things. But what I started seeing very quickly was that, okay, they go from like, there's a lot of like, well, we need to be better than this and not concede these issues to the right, to let's just pick up right-wing talking points. What do you think drives that?
Well, partly it tends to be very online, and online on social media and what have you, there's a lot of cliquishness, and it's like part of it is that they built a clique and they built their own bubble. And they wanted to react against the worst excesses of the left, which I understand. I mean, that's part of the reason why I started the Bellows, was because I was annoyed by a lot of the stupid shit. But the thing is you don't want to base your whole political project around hating leftists or hating things the leftists do, because I mean, we've seen what's happened in the last couple of years is a lot of those post-left people have become like DeSantis or Trump people. I mean, they became what people, you know, a lot of left liberals accuse them of being.
Yeah, it was really, you know, I think about Nina Powers. I'll be willing to name names on this one. I was listening to the Compact podcast, and I
exchanged emails with her yesterday, but no.
No. But you know, I'm not here to put you on the spot. But
I don't agree with everything that she says, or you know, any of those guys.
But I just bring it up because it's interesting, because she was arguing for DeSantis's like march through the universities, and the two conservatives, the two Catholic conservatives over there, were the people who were like, yeah, but aren't those institutions dying anyway? And isn't this a waste of time? And it was very strange to me, because I was like, you know, like, yeah. And to give Nina a little bit of break, I don't know her. I helped publish one of her books, I suppose, but
great name though too, Nina Power.
Yeah, it is a great name. But you know, maybe it's the fact that she's in the UK and doesn't have skin in the game. I don't know, but it was like, do you really want to grant anything to DeSantis? Like, look, I think once the nation really sees what he's doing, and that he has the personality of warm spit parroting Trump, I don't know that you're gonna feel good about this either. Because it doesn't seem like a wagon I would, even if I was a conservative, want to throw my my brand behind. At the same time, there is a lot of like liberal elite shenanigans right now that we really do need to start having a better response to, like because it is discrediting to be linked to it.
Yeah. Do we need drag shows everywhere? Do we need drag shows in church? I have a friend, my best friend. You know, he felt weird sending his kids to a summer camp with a bunch of drag shows. It's like, let's be a little strategic. Do we need to make drag the center of our cultural universe?
What I find interesting about that, even from the standpoint of like trans identity, to make drag equivalent to trans safety is itself a mistake. It is itself to like a great number of people who participate in drag are not are not transgender people. I mean, it's just it's confusing to me on a variety of levels, but it's also because we're letting responding to people set our agenda.
Exactly, and that is a lot of the post left, because you know, with the post left, I think part of the reason they have been flocking towards DeSantis is that, you know, DeSantis is running on being anti-woke. And
right.
a lot of the post left was like, hell yes, you know, this is what we've been saying all this time. And they enjoy, you know, seeing leftist liberal tears. But there's a sort of nihilistic element to that, you know?
It's extreme nihilistic element. I mean, I think about this the other day. I was arguing with my frenemy, good old Doug Lane, and he shared something by somebody who said wokeism was more dangerous than totalitarianism than fascism or communism. And I was like, one, bro, why are you sharing something that's got explicitly anti-communist, anti-socialist messaging in it already? But two, can you actually believe that? Like, do you actually think that? Like, I know you don't really think that. What you're worried about is government censorship. I think maybe you have a little bit of a too simple understanding of it, but I know this is not what you mean. But why would you even allow something to be framed that way? Right? Because you're giving aid and succor to someone that you know, all right, will censor you. I mean, the same people he's talking about running because he's got hopes on the weaponization of government panel. I'm like, dude, a lot of these same people also have their names as co-sponsors on the Restrict Act. Like, how can you trust any of this? Like, I do know we have to work with actual politicians. And I think maybe one thing that I say that makes people uncomfortable is like, dude, you have to be willing to work with politicians you hate. Like if you're going to mess in electoral politics at all, you have to be utterly mercenary about it, because these parties have no loyalty to you. They don't. Yeah. And don't try to justify. I mean, like, if you're trying to justify it with harm reduction, it seems like part of what goes on there is also finding the harm to which you can stay without changing anything, without saying we break. Like, it just very much seems that way. And also, there have been times where I've been like, can we like change the framing to something that is more inclusive of everybody? Like we can make an argument for protecting LGBTQ people, IA, whatever.
You gotta say that better.
Queer people.
Now you sound like Justin Trudeau.
Okay. Yeah, I know I do. It's so I as a side note, I have a stated belief that I'm like, I don't even really believe in sexuality as a concept, so which I know like really bothers everybody. And so like I just want to say like let's just defend people's autonomy, period, on 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 sex and gender, on like freedom of on bodily autonomy and freedom of social reproduction, right?
Yeah.
Like
Yeah.
we can do that. That
Yeah.
makes this an everybody issue, not an issue of just protecting victims, because protecting victims in a way is disempowering to both sides. Like it's an effective, it works as a moral effect to like get people to care about something, but it doesn't actually create a positive political program to do anything with that. And it
We,
makes you. It also makes you like you're not empowering people with that either. Like you're just like you are setting this up as like, well, we have to protect you. This is like our duty, and that to me is a fundamentally like liberal rights based framework, and I'm not that kind of liberal. I'm a fucking socialist. Like
we yeah, and we also don't have to elevate victims into, you know, the role models or the political subject that we need to base our politics around. um you know, we should have like, you know, the left should care about having, you know, active citizens who have good morals, you know, like role models. Like we don't need to elevate these certain kinds of people into, you know, again, putting victims on a pedestal is,
well, for what one thing with a lot of people, it's a way to like it feels, unless you are one of these truly tragic figures who's killed in this stuff, it also feels like we're setting these people up for a fall, um, and it almost is inevitable that that happens, and on the left in particular, um, and I'm just like, no, we should. There's something about our particular period of social alienation where I know this feels, because I don't just think it's, I will say this, I don't just think it's a left wing problem.
yeah.
Like negative partisanship seems to be it seems to be at least a US problem, but I have a, like from talking to people abroad, it seems to actually be kind of a developed West problem.
Oh yeah, and conservatives definitely fall into the victimization, self-victimization a lot, trap themselves. So it's a mutually reinforcing thing.
Right. I mean, it's actually in this um, way a it's self-reinforcing. It's also like it really sets up bad incentives, and you have a like you have a really hard time setting up a positive political program with it. Um, and I do think there's a reason why this is attractive to college educated, mostly right, but not always, middle and upper middle class liberals. Like,
Yeah.
because it is kind of the way schools work. Like, like,
What do you mean?
well, because schools are supposed to function as a meritocracy, and one of the ways that you do that is that you correct for disadvantages um, as a way to like equalize the merit. That's how these, particularly in universities more than secondary and primary schools, that's how like you get advantages in the universities. Like, okay, well, you come from a background, we're supposed to be a meritocratic institution, we're going to give you these additional supports, and we're going to give you this additional access, right? Like to compensate for your lack of prior access. Now, in reality, in universities, this doesn't work, but that is the self justification of a lot of the way like we do think, like, I teach a preparation for college course concurrently through university. One of the things where I was talking about is like, oh, how to advocate for yourself to get your high school IEP for other concessions for your special needs in university. And I'm like, that model seems to be part of the model when paired with also 60s civil rights narratives from the standpoint of the way they're taught to you in school, not the way they actually happened. It seems to be what drives this whole framework. But I really do believe you have to be in certain kinds of jobs to believe that is possible in society as a way to fix things. Mm-hmm. You have to already have shit. Like, because it's, you know, I don't see how that works, like, in general society in general. And I do think, you know, this leads to this inability to. I mean, one of the great hypocrisies of this time for me is like what we talked about earlier. It's like we've made so little gains, even on general racial wealth disparities, except oddly in the South, and that's because white people have gotten poorer, not because anyone has come up.
Yes.
Like, why should we be excited about that at all? Like,
yeah, why should we be excited about Atlanta? The fact that there's an incredible amount of Black leadership plus a Black upper middle class, and yet the inequality is the biggest in the nation. Why exactly are we celebrating
that? It's just like, it doesn't seem like it's that great for people of color either. And honestly, I think it's why we've seen this increasing trend in the Pew polls where, and this is something I've been arguing with myself with the if you've read the Robert Brenner, Dylan Riley, 7 Theses, blah, 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 piece. If you haven't, don't worry about it. You don't need to, but like, that's why I've been arguing with it. But it's kind of like, well, you know, the left has misunderstood what class struggle is, and so this neo-progressivism is really the best thing we can do, because class struggle has never really been an electoral project. And I'm like, well, kind of, yes, class struggle hasn't been an electoral project. Class politics is separate from that, although what they call class politics is interesting because their class politics is like not the New Deal, but the precursor to the Great Society, and then like the Civil Rights Movement. I'm like, okay.
Is this similar to what's his name? He gets published by Compact, who wrote the new class war.
It's kind of the seeming Marxification of that, like,
okay.
And honestly, I think Michael Lind, who wrote the new class war,
Michael Lind,
whose politics I find scary. But I have to admit, some of his political analysis have been better, like, than what I'm seeing.
I don't disagree.
But yeah, because Lind has been talking about, like, you know, the neo-progressivism, but it's like one of the elites, and then the Republicans basically have like 2/3 of the old Democrat Party coalition of like the petite bourgeois and like protectionist needing Rust Belt industries and parts of the working class, but no one has all of it because the working class is largely, in Lynn's mind, kind of dormant. Like, and I think actually there's a lot of truth to that to some degree, that like even in 2016, when you had astronomical for the U.S. like levels of participation in the election, it still was not like, if you were to look at like, and it's hard to talk about the working class in the United States because we don't really keep stats the way that Marxists would define that. But if you looked at, say, the working poor, which is something I feel a little bit more clear that you could talk about, they still don't vote as much. Part some of it in like the Southeast because they can't, because of felon laws and whatnot. But voter participation amongst that class, even though it's higher than it has been in the past, is still relatively low. And as I tell people, like, why shouldn't it be? Like, what have you done for them? like, you know,
Yeah.
like, particularly in non-urban metropole mega areas like New York, LA, you know, the big West Coast cities, to some degree Atlanta, because it just, like, you talk about like the exurban like you even take a place like Jackson, Mississippi, which has a, you know, a leftist mayor, and it's like, what has anyone done for them? Like that Mayor Lumumba is always like fighting like he can't get much done because he's fighting everybody, including like all the state legislature, the feds, and
Well, yeah, and the state is kind of partially taken over there.
right. And so it's just like, and you have in these southern states people, now that there actually are municipalities that are like being led by you know, more left-winging black politicians, that stuff is being clawed away from city control. Yeah, absolutely. And so it also doesn't seem like this electoral strategy just doesn't really seem to work. Like, I'm not, and this to me isn't a critique of the mayor. Like, I actually don't have a problem with that mayor, but that's neither here nor there. That it's like you're not launching anything to protect these people either when they actually try to do something like that. And these are precisely the areas that A, you're supposed to care the most about, and B, if you're ever going to be able to like not be beholden to the right in the Democratic Party as any sort of strategy, you would have to have the ability to say like, look, you know, if we don't help you, like, we're going to give a battleground state to the other side. Whereas like if you're dumping all of your money, and our friends in the DSA actually kind of are, into areas like, I don't know, New York. You're not actually like the Democrats are going to control that no matter what under current conditions.
Yeah.
So what are you going to do? And I really think like, I don't know. I've been talking a lot, but I really think the left doesn't have like a banal agenda. Like, you know,
Well, yeah, I mean, Chicago just elected Brandon Johnson,
mm-hmm.
who, you know, and I spent 15 years in Chicago, and you know, I used to be in the DSA there, and the DSA is very excited for Brandon Johnson, and I think, you know, I think I would have voted for him, I support him, but how much is he going to really get done? What in his agenda is he going to really get done? It's not clear to me, you know, what exactly a Brandon Johnson administration is going to do to really change the game for a lot of the, you know, poverty-stricken areas of Chicago. There's a lot of talk. I mean, even Lori Lightfoot talked a good game about helping those areas, and you know, then it got funneled into, oh, you know, we're gonna support artists from that area. You know what I mean? Like the creative class can do pretty good, but you know, the vast majority of the working class just gets fucked.
Right. That's
And
something.
and maybe I sound too negative, but
Well, I mean, my big thing is like, even if I assume absolutely that the mayor has a plan that is viable, he's got to have Pritzker and the rest of Illinois on board. And I don't think that's gonna happen. So, like, I like, that's the thing about basically only having a municipal and a national strategy. Which,
yeah, because capital flight is a real thing, you know, and
yeah,
you know,
particularly in cities.
in cities, yeah. I mean, Chicago has in the last, you know, 5 years, and during the pandemic, there was a lot of capital flight, and a flight of population, literal population, and so you could have, you know, the People's Republic of Chicago or San Francisco or whatever, but there can be consequences to that, and we live under capitalism. And when capital moves, you know, what else is there? Or this is capitalism, you know what I mean?
Yeah, and then you have, I mean, you mentioned San Francisco, and you have things like the San Francisco Reparations Committee, which in
Mm,
March put out this thing that was like,
yeah.
uh, that the city should give $5 million to every eligible person who met like this criterion, but it's an insanely actually restricted criterion too. But it was
Yeah.
like, so you should basically make 2% of your population millionaires. Um, uh, on the backs of what? Now I know, and I think, I mean, this is what I don't get. Like maybe they're trying to negotiate from a point of strength, but I'm like, why is it, even if you believe in reparations, that you think a West Coast city should be the person responsible for doing that? And why do you think a direct cash payment of $5
People that
million,
vote Democrat. You're
right?
gonna punish Democrats.
Like, um, and how do you think that that would like play out? Like, like, why would you even suggest that? Because it's also going to be highly divisive in the Black community itself, because a whole lot of people are not going to meet the criterion, as in say most of
Yeah.
them.
And
So
you know what would have the potential to do? I worked on this story a few years ago about Native Americans and
mhm.
the fight over identity, because there was so much federal resources that were being devoted to people that qualified as indigenous. Well, who decides who's indigenous? That was the question. And there were people that were like, accusing each other of not of being white, not really being indigenous. So imagine that, but like escalated, because we still don't give a lot of resources to Native Americans. But imagine if there's millions and millions of dollars involved. Like,
Well, yeah, like at a personal household level, that if you qualify for this, you'll get $5 million.
okay,
Like,
yeah,
but that's the suggestion, in addition to 100 other things that they suggested as well. And I was like,
yeah, it's a clown show.
one, okay, just to explain, just explain the economics of this. The United States government could probably do something like that, and it not actually be a tax burden on everybody. They would still figure it as one, but it wouldn't actually
Well,
be
for
one.
San Francisco,
Right.
right?
But for San Francisco, you have to directly raise taxes to do that.
Yeah,
That has to come out of the general city fund.
yeah. And you already have companies that are leaving San Francisco. They would really join Elon in Texas or go to Florida if that would
Absolutely.
happen.
Or just go to fucking San Diego, even.
Right. Yeah.
It's just like, so why even suggest that? Because there's no way that the
No.
Democrats are going to pass that. So, like, why even suggest that unless you accept to, I don't know, give right wing media a heyday?
Yeah.
Like, what's the
Well,
point?
it's like San Francisco is like the virtue signaling capital of of the country. So, you know,
Um,
a lot of symbolic politics goes on in San Francisco.
it's, I mean, and yeah, interestingly, San Francisco is one of the areas that has some of the least like partaking in the kind of socialist left. Like LA has a lot more people partaking in it. I know this in terms of media and in terms of like organizational funding. Like San Francisco doesn't contribute to a lot. You were like, oh, of course it would. No, it doesn't. Like
Mm.
it's really does not. Um, uh, Now I don't just say that. I got interested in this. Actually, I'll admit this, because I was looking at my own stats and I was like, huh. I have listeners in San Diego and Sacramento, and I have a few in San Francisco, but like it's way less than say LA. The majority of my listeners are in New York, which I'm not gonna knock it, but it doesn't make me the happiest either. But I was like, why is that? What is going on there? Like, so it seems like the symbolic politics is about an inch deep left at this point.
Hmm.
Like, also the DSA is stronger in South California than in the North. So,
Well, isn't there? What about Oakland though?
Oakland is better, but
Yeah.
Oakland has been rapidly gentrified. Not,
Yeah.
not again. I hate even thinking about that, but it's just a fact. Like so, and Oakland is another city that has like a black middle class, but it's a highly unequal city now too, and a lot of like working class people in the are and a lot of working class and even working professional like middle class professional people in the Bay Area are now living as far out as like Modesto.
Hmm.
Like,
Well, I'm sure that accelerated during COVID too,
right. So
because
it's just oh yeah, yeah. Actually, San Francisco is one of the few places where rent's been significantly trending down because people just left. Um
yeah. Well,
uh
the tech exodus, and they 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 were the closest thing that we had to China's COVID restrictions in this country. It was in San Francisco.
so yeah, I guess that we've kind of been all over the place, but one of the things that I have one of the things that really turned me off during the end of the not that we're ever out of COVID, but we are out of the pandemic effectively. Um, uh, uh,
Mission accomplished.
we're not going to mention how many people died after Biden took office, are we?
Yeah.
But anyway, um, or how many policies didn't change, but um, the if you looked at the death ratios for COVID, one of the things that I was kind of fighting with people is I would hear people in San Francisco and Portland and stuff go like, well, those other people, you know, they're, I had someone just reply, they're just too stupid. They're basically animals. And this person called themselves a socialist. And I was like, how in the fuck
Mm.
can you believe that working class people in the majority of the country are basically animals? Also, like, I live in a very red state. Uh, we had very cautious and kind of severe COVID restrictions at first. We did not have them later on. Um, uh, I learned a lot about COVID transmission through the schools, and it was very interesting because in the United States we just refused to admit that like there was a very different virulency ratio even amongst adults working in schools between elementary school and high school. We just wouldn't talk about it. Like
Hmm.
we were pretending we had to have the same
Yeah.
policies for both, and I'm like, it doesn't make any sense. Um, Even like the Nordic countries and both the Sweden and the other ones, they did not do that. Like they would like the criterion for closing high schools was faster than closing elementary schools, and most elementary schools stayed open without significant like increased mortality. Um, and I just remember them like just talking about like people in the area where I live as if like they were all just dumb. And I'm like, one, okay, someone in Portland doesn't get to talk about like how dumb the rest of the people are and claim to be an anti-racist when you're talking about places like, I don't know, Atlanta. Uh,
Yeah.
Two, uh, it's also just not true. And by the way, the COVID death stats are not correlated to the severity of policy or whether or not it was a red and blue state. Like it was actually correlated primarily to age, the average age of the state. Utah did not have a very high death rate.
Mormons are very healthy.
Like
They don't drink caffeine. Like the Mormons are onto something. Mitt Romney's gonna live to 120.
God. But like in all seriousness, it's like the Western states actually did not have high death rates like the Southern states did. And I'm like, a lot of it's age,
obesity, and poverty rates.
Right, exactly. And like we're a younger state here in Utah. We're one of the lowest obesity states, and you know what? That's social policy too. Honestly, like this is another thing that I like tell people. I'm like I'm not for shaming people for health choices, but a lot of this, like the obesity, is social policy. Like it is like don't pretend like it doesn't have an effect when it's like a negative effect of bad capitalist planning and like shitty food sources and all that kind of stuff. Like,
and the left has a hard time talking about any of that. I mean,
well, because we want to have our cake and eat it too on a lot of the stuff. Like, I actually do not think shaming fat people, because that's actually probably preferred nomenclature now, is going to help anything. I do not think that. But I do think, like, let's admit that like having some social policy that like encourage this on a population level probably would have an effect. I left the country, I lost 100 pounds. I left the South, I lost 100 pounds just by leaving. Like, I wasn't trying to. I wasn't like, you know, people trying to like make like a moral success story. I'm like, no, I was in a different context where the health incentives are different. Like,
you were probably used to having Chick-fil-A's every other block.
and and driving everywhere. And you know, when I moved to Korea, which had great public transit, like I lost weight because like I walked to the public transit and it was great. I got everywhere. I could go anywhere in the country. That's harder to do in the United States because the size of the country, not going to belittle that difference. But we don't even have that regionally. And like you were saying before, a lot of leftists, they don't seem to want to do that either. Like, yeah, they talk about infrastructure, but then when you actually do it and you have to deal with its effect on like gentrification, et cetera, then they kind of freak out about it. And then like, I'm like, you know, and like you were talking about YIMBYism, the YIMBY-NIMBY debate drives me up the wall.
Yeah.
Like, it's like, you're not going to fix the systemic problems of capital just by like inviting some people into your neighborhood.
Right.
Like, that, like, I'm glad you're doing it. I think I'm glad you're doing it if you actually do it consistently, which I somehow doubt. But
you know, in a way, the YIMBY-NIMBY debate sometimes can just be like the greater like conservative liberal reaction and counter reaction, where both sides are in their own world and won't, you know, like have a coherent vision of the future. It's just like, I hate what the other people are doing and I'll do the exact opposite.
Yeah, I mean, that's different from having like a positive program or policy or like, if you're going to play electoralism, there has to be like, okay, under certain conditions, if people will do X, I will work with them regardless. Like, or I will work with them as long as it's like there's Y and we're not going to accept Y, right? But that's clearly stated. But if they don't do Y and they're helping us in X, we'll ignore A, B, C, D. Like, and in American politics, actually, I want to ask you about this. You know, you've been a political reporter for a long time now. Yeah. Why do you think people seem incapable of this? Is it because they don't understand local politics and those trade-offs? Like, what do you think is going on there? Like, why can't they do that anymore? Because that's a bipartisan issue.
Yeah, I mean, localism over the last generation or two has slowly dwindled. And, some of it is just a function of we've lost a lot of the community ties that we used to have, and between neighbors, community, churches, schools, what have you. And we are sort of we're all in this like mass media world where, back in the say 70s and 80s, it became more of like regional, and now and then national, and now like, globally we're a part of this spectacle. And so that's part of the reason. And politics is national politics has become an aspect of that. And so there's not a lot of incentive to deal with local politics, because um, it is messy. You have to go somewhere to go to meetings, and you're not going to get social media points for having a stance on local zoning. You're not gonna be an influencer in zoning laws. You know what I mean? And
but it's interesting to me because we had this Gen X period where like everybody was super local to like an absurd degree, but basically not local in the participation in local government, but like local, and I guess we could have our own communities and co-ops and anarcho like activist movements for Seattle.
Alternative capitalism,
right? Yeah. But when I talk to these people who, and this was my critique of the Bernie movement, actually, like from 2016 to 2020, was like, you have to build local infrastructure for this to work, even if you win. Like, one of the reasons why people in the South hate government services is because government services are administered shittily on purpose in the South. Like, like it's a feedback loop. To stop that, you would have to have cadres at the local level to work with who have power and who do things like zoning, like the kind of messy, stupid shit of politics. And particularly as long as like you do have to deal with shit like capital flight and whatnot if you are not yet actually at national level power. Like, yeah, I don't think mega corporations are going to leave the United States and give up dollar hegemony necessarily, but they will definitely move from Chicago to, I don't know, Memphis or something, like, or Houston, like, for sure.
No, and I believe strongly in localism, and that's part of the reason why I haven't been writing as much stuff for, say, Jacobin lately. I have a full-time job. I don't know if I mentioned this. I work for a local news nonprofit called Atlanta Civic Circle. I'm the democracy reporter, because I do believe that the left needs to focus on local first. I do think. I mean, you mentioned Bernie, and I think Bernie was a little bit of a cheat code. It was trying to bypass all of that hard ass work to, like, build or transform institutions. And we got kind of close, maybe not that close, but it was cool. But now we can see we're like back at that level, that pre-Bernie level, the left, and boy,
yeah, I feel like even though we have the DSA, even though socialism is, well, it's less popular than it was in 2018, actually, but it's still more popular than it has been in general historically.
Yes.
In America, except for like before 1921. Like, in the 19 teens, socialists commanded like something like 12 to 14% of the vote. So but since then, and even still now, we're in this moment, and yet I feel not just like we're back before the Bernie movement. I feel like we're back before Occupy, like that we have gone that far back. You have, because what was the character of Occupy, pre-Occupy activism? It was all, and even Occupy started as this. It was all like specific issue driven activism. And that's why I left the left for a long time. Like I couldn't stand that shit. Like it was just like the alter globalization movement, which was bigger, but like tended to just get into niche stuff. You had the anti-war protests, which I supported, but like they tended to just be about foreign policy. They didn't tie anything in together for most of that period. It's like we're not in the context of like the Bush years where like, and I also think people forget how bad the early 2000s were. Like if you think jingoism was bad under Trump, it was worse in 2002.
Yeah, and all we had at the time was fucking Jon Stewart to yell about it. We didn't
Right.
really have much of a left media at that time.
No, I mean like that was the time when like the nation was dying. I guess the ISO had a magazine, and that was there was no there was no podcast for the first half of that. The second half of that, they were all libertarian. Like it was
Adbusters.
Yeah. I mean, Adbusters and like the Baffler, but it was a very different magazine back then. Yeah. Mother Jones, which was purely at that point an adjunct of the Democratic Party, and yeah, and I guess you had Democracy Now on Pacifica Radio if you lived in a big city.
Right. Yeah, Doug Henwood was doing something, I guess.
Yeah, Doug Henwood. There were 3 left podcasts, and they were actually all Pacifica Radio shows. Yeah. That was the time, and it feels closer to that now, even though we have an infrastructure. We have the remains of the Bernie movement. But people seem very afraid to actually have a positive agenda. And I hate to say it, but the negative agenda only helps Democrats. Like,
well, yeah, I mean, you had, last night, and I don't know if anything happened tonight, you had all these leftist New Yorkers out on the streets about, this unfortunate death of this homeless person on the subway, which, it was a bad deal. And I'm not saying that people shouldn't be out for that or shouldn't be upset, but then you look over at what's happening in France and in Paris, and, I'm jealous about what's going on there.
I think that, and I think it's interesting though, because I have said when people are like, oh, we need to be like in France, and I'm like, but we were 2 years ago.
Yeah, but about way different issues. You're not
right.
In France. It's mostly about economics. I mean, the retirement age is an economic issue. Where are we in the streets for economic issues in America?
That's a fair counterpoint. I think we have to ask ourselves a couple of questions, like, because I actually do think the George Floyd stuff was about a lot more than just police brutality ultimately, but we didn't pivot on that. We didn't say like, okay, like not only do we need this shit to stop, we need this, and this. Like we need to stop letting these fucking left behind upper Midwest cities just be completely desiccated, like, and that the only thing you have holding it together is the fucking police. That's what we should have done. At that moment, we chose to listen to for a brief period of time, and now people complain about it. Like people make fun of, even people on the center, like central liberals make fun of Robin DiAngelo, but that everyone like bit down on right fragility and on like diversifying television.
Candide.
Yeah. And it's just like that didn't change what's going on in those to me that happened twice with BLM, because the first time in Ferguson, I'm like, there's conditions and these are economic conditions as well as police conditions leading to this shit, specifically where it's at, right? Which is like these ex factory cities that have been deindustrialized and completely left behind and gutted of most of their social services, and also are majority black. And like these things are directly tied together. And when these like justice movements started, people will talk about that and then that's dropped. And I also point out that's when this moves from St. Louis, Minneapolis, even Kenosha, to Seattle, Portland. Like, I don't think that's an accident. I don't think it's on purpose either, but it is a systemic. It's showing you like what not tying this stuff into this makes it. Which is not to say that people don't have legitimate grievances in Portland, but like the conditions there are utterly different than Minneapolis, and don't pretend they're not.
Right.
Like, and so I guess that would be my like both agreeing with you and pushing back a little bit. Like there is a real economic issue to what happened in to the Black Lives Matter, particularly the Ferguson one, honestly, because like that's a long term thing. We never kept it about that. Like you even like what the first Black Lives Matter, what happened? Like it moves from the streets of poor communities in St. Louis and outside of St. Louis and Ferguson into St. Louis and then stuff in Maryland into college campuses. Like, and I'm just like, if you don't want to make Adolph Reed look right, don't make Adolph Reed look right. Like,
no, and it is true that Black Lives Matter, at some point on their website, it had a list of economic demands that, a lot of it was pretty good, but it really got subsumed by a very narrow focus. And part of it is the media didn't really want to talk about that part, but it seemed like in a lot of cases, the destruction of, say, Confederate statues, especially in the South, or things like that, or like in universities where we're taking off slave owners' names, that really, took a lot of the momentum out of those movements. And in fact, in 2020, I briefly lived in Mobile, Alabama, and at that time, I actually was part of a march downtown for BLM, but this activist group disbanded after they took down the statue of the Confederate admiral, and so there just wasn't enough behind this movement. The energy of the movement was sort of this short-term burst of anger and let's tear down some statues and then go home and go back to brunch.
All right. Well, I mean, we can also talk about what's different between us and France. Like, for all of France's neoliberalization, which is pretty thorough, it does still have pretty strong unions who can actually mobilize people. Like, and I do believe, I've said this a lot lately, I do believe there is actual worker militance out there. I think it's increased. But let's not pretend that that's actually translated into a revived union movement in America, because it's just, the stats do not back that up. So yeah, unions are popular, but less people are in them as a proportion of the country than before. And actually, even if you buy the whole like, well, more people are back to work, so it's actually grown, but then I point to, it's still less than it was even 6 years ago. Like, yeah, like even adjusting for the difference in working population. Like, it's important. Even you want to talk about like people not seeing the forest for trees. It's important that we support stuff like Starbucks workers. It's important because also that sector is highly not unionized. It's like something like 1 or 2% of food workers are unionized. At the same token, pretending that farmers were not farm workers, baristas and food service workers and TAs and adjuncts are able to replace the industrial union movement, even though services are 80% of the economy, this not 80% of the economy unionizing. Like in both cases, you're dealing largely with transitory and temporary workers who are going to have a hard time building organizing skills over a long term.
Yeah.
And honestly, there's also perverse incentives for the union movements themselves about that, because it's money, but it's not competition for union leadership. Like, we need to be honest about what that is. Like,
Well, not only that, but we've been talking a lot about localism tonight. And the thing about a lot of the old industrial unions is that they were actually part of communities, and they could help drive the politics of the city, and not just getting together to endorse Bernie, but they were actually helping change local politics. And I don't think the Starbucks union is going to do that.
No, I mean, theoretically, Amazon United could, but I haven't seen it grow enough outside of New York for it to do that yet. And there is also an incentive for all this to be fought on a national level, particularly with the Democrats. I don't know exactly what that's about. With the Democrats' tendency to try to turn every local battle national, and then also ignore that they did not actually build up the stuff locally to win, aka the Beto and Cynthia McKinney campaigns, when both those people we're going to make these people president, and I'm like, they can't even win their local elections. And you've already thrown them out as media figures, and thus presidential hopefuls. That's absurd.
And I think in the near future, Democrats maybe will do some lip service towards unions, but with the economy possibly heading to a recession, and they've been dealing with issues of worker shortages in certain areas, that they're not going to change a lot of policy to be pro-union. I don't think.
Absolutely not. I think the railroad stuff actually means that abundantly clear, that there's a limit and there it is. When it's actually going to maybe affect more than some like a service chain. No, they're not actually on that side. I don't know. We're gonna top the red stuff, but I think that point that we talked about in the South is really, maybe the key point here. Is if you want a national movement, you actually have to work locally. You can't build the infrastructure, and that means also caring about a lot of unsexy shit. It doesn't mean you have to drop caring about trans people, I don't think, but you do have to, you need to start learning zoning laws. You need to start learning why these hospitals are closing. You need to start figuring out what's smart to do at the local level and what's not, because for example, Medicare for all in one city is actually a terrible idea.
100%.
It's not a good idea. So by locally, I don't mean doing the let's just, I don't know, try to carry out these national policies at a local level, because that's going to go real poorly. But you do have to do local stuff. You have to property values, homelessness stuff, housing. Those are in the United States legally local issues.
Oh yeah, there's no real national housing policy, and if you listen to the presidential debates, they barely talked about housing. It is 100% a local issue.
And if you want to make it a national issue, you actually still have to do enough at the local level to start to and I think that's the big takeaway. And so anything you like to say in closing, and anything then after that, anything you like to plug?
What did I say in closing? Gosh. I don't know. We talked a lot about Atlanta, and it is a very fascinating time to live here because I do feel, I mean, even though I don't feel like Georgia is really um, I don't think the future of the 2024 election is necessarily going to be here, even though some people are talking that way. But between you had this national figure of Stacey Abrams, you had Warnock in Ossoff election, and Atlanta, in some sense, is sort of the I feel like the center of the country politically in certain ways. So yeah, it's a fascinating time to be here and report here.
Yeah, I do think is if people think like these the quote purple states are going to be like where the like ideological future is going to be hashed out, uh, because everybody who tells me that California is the future of the United States, I'm like, well, that's a scary thought. Um,
Yeah. Yeah, Gavin
like
Newsom can go to hell as far as I'm concerned. I hate that guy.
like it's just like okay, so we get a lot of virtue signaling and some protections for some people, but also massive impoverishment, uh, really bizarre incentives. Like, yes, there's unions, but yeah, you're also gigifying everything. I don't really want that future. Like, um, but so thank you so much for coming on. And if people want to read you, where can they find your work right now?
Right now, I'm mostly working for a news nonprofit called Atlanta Civic Circle. But in the meantime, I'm still writing occasionally for Jacobin and Compact. And you should come to my trivia at the West Side Motor Lounge in Atlanta on Wednesday nights if you get a chance.
Awesome.
I'm a trivia host and also a trivia writer right now, so that's a cool side gig.
Awesome. All right. Thank you so much for coming on, Ryan. And uh, thank you for staying up with me. It's a lot later in your coast than it is mine. So,
Yeah, no, it's been a pleasure. Appreciate the conversation.
yeah, thank you so much.